Hello everyone, welcome to my channel or welcome back for returning viewers. My name is Lee and I'm a toy designer, illustrator, and part-time content creator. For today's video, I will be taking you through my process of customizing a doll from concept to physical art piece. As this is likely going to be one of my first doll customization videos on this channel, I decided to choose an existing character to work off of, rather than design one solely from scratch. I'll definitely get around to posting my completely original character designs that have been translated into doll form soon, but for now, I thought it would be a good idea to start with something familiar and then branch out. If you aren't very familiar with Strawberry Shortcake, she started out as a greeting card design in the 70s and grew from there. Over time, the roster of characters increased, and the illustrations were then adapted into media and different types of merchandise. While I have appreciation for the many iterations of Strawberry Shortcake and her friends, my favorite designs have to be the original 70s illustrations. I love the more vintage illustration style and their odd yet pleasing proportions, and their simple yet effective designs. When planning this video, I originally intended on just redesigning Strawberry Shortcake in my style, but as I kept creating designs, none of them felt very inspired. This dilemma brought me to a question. How can I bring something new to this brand that has been around for over 50 years? With these fruit dessert themed characters which have been adapted throughout the different decades, I noticed each iteration became a reflection of their time, extending all the way up until the recent 2023 release. In my own work, I aimed to follow along with the theme of her design being a reflection of the time, but I struggled with maintaining the whimsy vital to the core of this brand. This is going to be a little bit of a side tangent, but I think the most recent adaptation of Strawberry Shortcake is a prime example of what I just described. 2023's Strawberry Shortcake, Berry in the Big City, attempts to modernize the cast and environment, but does so in a way that betrays the original by completely removing all the magical and whimsical elements that made the characters so appealing in the first place. In short, the end goal for my rendition of Strawberry Shortcake is to avoid repeating history, by instead maintaining the character's roots in magic and whimsy, while also bringing something more fresh and modern as well. After multiple brainstorming sessions and preliminary design rounds, I finally found a common ground between these contradictory goals. I decided to direct my designs towards the Strawberry Shortcake characters as magical girls concept. In my personal iteration of the characters, they would have non-magical everyday looks, but also whimsical over-the-top ones as well. They would exist as the bridge between a world of magic and mundane life. Ideally, we'd follow them along on their journey defending Berryland, as well as their time reckoning with real-life struggles. But enough of my idealistic concept that will probably go nowhere. You're here for the doll, so let's get to it. Despite my rant and minor analysis of the Strawberry Shortcake brand, I actually will not be making a doll of Strawberry Shortcake herself in this video. I'm not saying it won't happen ever, I just came to the conclusion that in order to not lose motivation on this project, which I so often do, I felt I should do my favorite character rather than one I just feel obligated to do. And on that note, here is my Magical Girl redesign of my favorite character from the franchise, Orange Blossom. For this project, I chose G3 Monster High Claudine as my base. This doll is from the Scaradise Island release, I believe, so she is missing chest articulation. Here's the bare doll so you can see what I'm talking about. Sorry Claudine, but it has only just begun. The first thing I do is remove the rooted hair. Initially, I was considering saving the hair for future projects, so I was cutting more precisely, but halfway through, I decided I didn't like the color enough, so I just started whacking it all off. Once she is nearly bald with a buzz cut as short as my scissors could allow, I dunk the head in hot water and let it swish and soak a bit, just to loosen up the glue inside and soften the plastic. Once the head had its time in the hot tub, I gently squeeze around the neck hole to remove its head without breaking the... So, I broke the neck peg. Do as I say, not as I do, I guess. Anyways, try your best not to break the neck peg, but if you do, consider watching Delightful's neck peg repair video. Now that the head is separated, I remove the ears because I want her to have human ears instead. Using the ear holes and existing neck hole, I pull the hair out of the plugs and desperately try to fish the broken neck peg out of her head. Once the head is clear enough from hair plugs, I use 100% acetone to remove the factory paint on her face and head. I tried to get in the crevices as best as I could using the edge of my nail in patience, but in the end, a Q-tip may have been more efficient. With the head all cleaned off and the neck peg repaired, we can now move on to more cosmetic alterations. Since I knew from the beginning I would not be rerouting this doll, I didn't bother finding a malleable material to fill the holes in the head. Instead, I just used epoxy to patch up the head and sketched a parting pattern directly onto the scalp. After blocking out where the braids would be, I went back in with a smaller brush and gave her edges and more detailed hair parting. Now onto the face-up. When I paint my doll's faces, I tend to prefer a strong painterly style with a heavy contour and bold contrast. I should also note that I basically only use acrylics. Please don't come for me, y'all. I hate the mess of chalk pastels, and it's hard for me to find MSC, so I use it very sparingly. Anyways, moving on. For this face-up, I referenced a digital illustration I made earlier in the concept phase, and tried to match it as closely as I could. Here's her face with both sides done. Oh, and I almost forgot the ears, so I quickly made epoxy ears with wires attaching them to the head. The next thing I focused on was the hair. Instead of buying pre-braided strands, which probably would have saved me a lot of time, I braided each of the pieces by hand. All these individual braids would eventually become the cornrows part of this hairstyle. I tried my best to get the braids as small and neat as possible, but I'll be the first to admit I'm not the best braider. I have short pin straight hair myself, so my experience braiding has been limited to my dolls, and then my desperate friends. Nonetheless, I was able to get the cornrows to be a decently suitable size for the doll. Once the braids were all ready, then I attached them to the head with glue and then touched up the roots. Lastly, I added the oversized afro puffs. Despite the curls of the hair fiber being a bit looser and bigger than I had originally hoped, I was able to create a style that resembled afro puff pigtails on this scale. With the face up and hair complete, I was able to move on to the clothing. For my dolls, I almost always design my own sewing patterns for their clothes. I have a bit of sewing experience, specifically in apparel, so this part of the process has become sort of second nature to me. I first drew out a sketch of the outfit in my notebook to remind myself of all the parts I needed. Once I had everything listed out, I began drafting ideas for the patterns of each piece, hence the chicken scratch on the side of the page. Once I drew out the patterns, tested a few of them, and felt confident enough to start for real, I began sewing out the outfit, beginning with the top. The first part of the top was pretty simple. It was just a crop tube top. The next part, however, was a bit more challenging. In this design, my orange blossom wears a Bardot top, otherwise known as an off-the-shoulder top. In order to achieve the off-the-shoulder look while also having puffy sleeves underneath, I fashioned a pattern that resembles an isosceles trapezoid. For my non-geometry nerds, this is what I'm referring to. With the trapezoid cut out, I hem the top edge and sew a gathering stitch towards the bottom. After gathering the bottom of the sleeve to a tightness I was pleased with, I made sure to flip the garment piece so that the seams were facing outwards and then sewed the edges together. Once everything was secured, I flipped it right sides out and I had a slightly poofy off-the-shoulder sleeve. Easily the most complicated part of this top was the ruffle neckline. For this part of the top, I sewed a narrow section along the rectangular strip of fabric and then inserted an elastic string into the section. After securing the ends of the elastic, I was left with a stretchy ring of fabric that would serve as the base of the neckline for the top. With the neckline of the top ready, all I had to do after that was create a ruffle long enough to span the length of the bottom and cover the non-hemmed edge. With the top pieces all separately assembled, I was able to add smaller details like a tiny green bow at the front and then white polka dots. And finally, I put all the pieces together and we had a finished top. A little bit out of order, but the next thing I ended up working on was the socks. Using the doll as a reference, I was able to come up with a simple long sock pattern. I ran into issues, however, when it came to the actual sewing part. After I had already bought materials for this project, I then realized I did not have the correct fabrics for the socks. Instead of buying more elastic and stretchy fabric, I bought regular cotton. By the time I realized my mistake, it was a bit too late, so I kept moving forward with what I had. Finding white and green striped stretchy fabric on a doll scale is harder than you'd think. Anyway, in order to get the socks to lay as I wanted as well as fit over the feet, I ended up just sewing the thigh highs directly to the doll. With the invisible stitch and a lot of patience, I was eventually able to make a decent pair of socks. To go a bit easier on myself, I made the belt / corset, which is basically just 2 strips of fabric and a bow. The third garment of her outfit I worked on was the skirt. For her skirt, I used the circle pattern method, but instead of a larger circle on the outside, I made the skirt have these sort of rounded points. These rounded points would end up being the bottom of the skirt. I cut out the pattern onto a lighter shade of orange fabric and used a fabric marker to change the color of the top of the skirt so that it would match the top. I also sealed the edges of the rounded points on the bottom of the skirt and added a layer of gathered tulle underneath to simulate a petticoat. In order to give the skirt more poof, I hand-stitched little darts along the valleys of the rounded points. I also added an additional layer of tulle to the petticoat. With these small revisions, the skirt started to look like an upside-down flower, which was what I originally intended. I also added a ruffle white trim to the edges of the skirt. And the finishing touch of the skirt was the apron. And here it is all together. In order to match the concept art more closely, I made a few hair accessories out of cardstock, mini gems, and epoxy, and then secured them with glue and prayers. The final part of her outfit was the shoes. I unfortunately did not get footage of the process for making the shoes, but there are much better videos explaining doll shoes than what I did anyway. In short, I used a wedge-based heel from an existing Monster High shoe, and then added straps with embellishments. And here she is all together, my Orange Blossom Magical Girl.